Oh, okay. It's now it's now 2:45 Central Time, 3:45 Eastern Time. This panel is joint with the Labor Employment Research Association. Uh, and the title of the panel is Inequality, Race, and Ethnicity. We have 4 papers. The first paper is by Leo Lewis, who is a professor at the University of Minnesota, whose paper will be on post-retirement employment, occupation, health of retired NFL players. The second paper is by Steve Ha from Western Carolina University, called The Asian Paradox. The third paper is Economic Returns to Han-Minzu Marriage, Evidence from Western China, by Manzu at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And the last paper is by Gregory Price and Doreen Pokua from the University of New Orleans. And the title paper is Trade Openness with China, an initial driver of cross-country human coronavirus infections. And our 2 discussants are William Spriggs from Howard University and myself. And so the pattern that we'll be using is we will give up to 20 minutes for each of the presentations. We'll wait until all 4 presentations are completed, and then we'll have 10-minute commentary from William Spriggs and myself, and then we'll open the floor. And I do hope that Gregory Price and his co-author are able to join before the panel is over. And so I'll stop sharing my screen, and I will now ask Professor Lewis take over.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Dr. Myers. I appreciate it. This presentation really represents a return professionally to doing research on professional athletes, and it's a follow-up on previous work that I did with colleagues that spanned over about 28 years. This is my first time presenting at this conference, so I want to make sure that as a guest, I'm compelled to, give some background that would serve as to why I am so passionate about doing work exploring the lives of NFL players. I played in professional football for 13 years in the United States and Canada, and I began my graduate work during my playing years, focusing on the subdiscipline of sport and sports science, the corporate culture of sport, including the media portrayals of athletes, really fascinated me. So more importantly, I was kind of living the same lifestyle that the popular media and other institutions also sensationalize. Yet, I believe each year my career could end pretty abruptly. So I chose to pursue scholarly and applied work primarily on elite amateur and professional sports, specifically focusing on the plight of athletes. And certainly for some players, the NFL could be a lucrative career, but many of us finish this line of work before we're 30 years old. So the purpose of this presentation is to introduce the contribution of prior research conducted by the author and colleagues on active NFL players, and then outline follow-up steps to engage a longitudinal examination of the same cohort of former professional athletes, and also to identify the results of a pilot study conducted currently that serves as a step toward a more expansive investigation on retired professional football players. The literature is replete with articles and investigations about the challenges facing professional football players upon leaving their careers in the National Football League. Often players enter the league and confronted dilemmas in their careers that put them at risk. Some players move on to successful careers in other endeavors, while others struggle with life after football. Many players are caught unprepared for the challenges of life after football. For example, in our 2003 NFL Player Development Survey, conducted among 1,600 active players, Lewis and Harold principal investigators discovered that the average length of one's career, as estimated by players, was 12.5 years. The actual length, according to the NFL's Vice President of Employee Development in 2008, was actually 4.2 years. The discrepancy players have between the expected and actual length is often caused by such things as career-ending injuries, the deselection process, among others. Thus, players may choose to delay their preparation for retirement. Retired players today are asked to participate in a wide variety of research initiatives, encouraged by the NFL and several research institutions that purport to support the livelihoods of these retired players, but have conducted ongoing investigations over the last decade. Comprehensive and diagnostic approaches examining former NFL players are conducted at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Tulane University, and the Cleveland Clinic. The most successful and ongoing initiative is the work conducted by Harvard University called the Football Players Health Study. Its intervention started in 2015 and continues in the evaluation of over 1,500 former NFL players with the intent of gaining a greater understanding of the health impact of a professional football career. Overall, the studies collected information about demographic characteristics, health conditions, physical function and ability, mental well-being, cardiovascular health, neurocognitive function, and pain management, as well as other conditions commonly expressed by former players. These result in asking participants, by and large, to reflect on the variables in order to determine their current physical and mental state. This current investigation and presentation, starting with IRB approval, the development of an instrument, identifying and locating former players, is an attempt to explore the lives of former NFL players after initial method of analysis was conducted in 1994 at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. At the time, 504 of 1,735 active NFL players who competed in the 1993 season were surveyed about their demographic variables, social support, network, perceptions, and the expectations of their careers while playing, and then also their retirement plans. Only 19 of the players surveyed identified themselves neither as Black nor white, ethnic background, resulting in a focus on comparisons among only Black and white athletes. So this investigation in 1994, supported by the NFL and the National League Players Association, offered a template for ongoing approaches that investigated the lives of active NFL players. As you see here, it gives a background on the 485 participants, their average age, which you see white players at this time were a bit older, had more experience, were by and large percentage-wise married compared to Black athletes. And there's a rundown of the field positions where that indicates the survey participants. So the conclusions of the study, by and large, if we look at some of the hypothesis testing, there are significant differences between white and Black players in terms of their expectations concerning their retirement from professional football. And the result was that there was modest support for the results for the following expectations of their post-career. So in looking at those expectations, we see some of the positive aspects that players look forward to: less competition, being injury-free and pain-free, having the opportunity to pursue other career interests and spend more time with family. the opportunity to enjoy the benefits of their work, for example, and the opportunity to travel. Some of the negative aspects or some of the things that they felt were going to be difficult in retirement was the loss of team membership, the loss of the challenge in competing in professional football, and the status of being an NFL player, the inability to replace football competition in their lives. And of course, naturally, maybe the loss of financial compensation as a professional football player. Other conclusions, let's go back to this. Other conclusions in their expectations of retirement, Black players gave stronger endorsement than white players for the opportunity to pursue other career interests, the opportunity to spend more time with family and friends, the opportunity to enjoy benefits of their hard work, and the opportunity to travel. On the other hand, white players expected to have more difficulty in retirement than Black players in the ability to replace football competition in their life, as well as more difficulty with the loss of financial compensation. So there were significant differences in a lot of variables. There were not significant differences in a lot of variables that I have listed as well. By and large, other comparisons between white and Black players showed a higher proportion of white players having their college degree before beginning their professional career, 62% compared to 43% of the Black players. And then also possessing a degree while active, 73% of the white players compared to 56% of the Black players. So this follow-up investigation is part of a long-term population study. The assessment tool consists of items for the purpose of, and in part, to collect more accurate demographic information, as well as current status, including information about the participants' years retired, the position they played, the marital status, and their race and ethnic origin. And this determines the participants' overall perceptions of their sports career. And then also an assessment on the participants' current status in terms of post-playing occupational history, educational attainment, retirement services that they used as a former player, with the intent of ongoing proposed research to survey the same cohort of players now 26 years or so later, to examine in part the relationship, if any, between personal and environmental factors earlier in their lives as players and the decisions that they made in retirement include their participation in some of these life maintenance activities, either offered by the NFL or initiated on their own. So this presentation offers the opportunity to explore variables that focus on participants' post-playing occupational history and educational attainment, as well as others. So the initial step in this investigation was a pilot whereby I interviewed retired players over the telephone and asked them to reflect on their careers at this point in their lives. This serves as a step before a more formal follow-up survey that is intended to be sent primarily electronically. Some of the objectives were to explore the nature of former players' current life situations, to examine the similarities and differences between the same Black and white players that were introduced to the initial study in 1994, and to determine if a relationship exists between life experiences, family background, employment, and education, among others. And certainly to gain retrospectively, now over 26 years later, players' views on what they could have done differently to make their post-career in employment more successful and satisfying. So we see a characteristic of the 12 individuals that I interviewed, their mean age and experience. So we have in this cohort so far an opportunity to see individuals who have almost 10 years of experience. So it's certainly not indicative of the overall cohort, but we also see that most of them all of them were married, and going down to the highest educational level, all but 3 have a bachelor's degree or some other formal licensure or degree after their bachelor's degree. We asked them to maybe give us a sense of what their current income is. Certainly they range from $50,000 a year primarily to up to $1 million a year. And then we also asked them how much they earned during their playing career, and they were more readily available to this, but certainly we have a great range so far in this small cohort of interviewees. If we have an indication here about their occupational goal when they were asked in 1994 as current players, and it looks like some of the results, meaning the results, the backgrounds that they have now are very similar. Some more information regarding whether they're currently employed or not. 2 are either what they indicated as not employed right now or retired. And again, their current employment is really conducive to what they set out in their bachelor's degree program. Challenges in retirement, playing with injuries was probably the most, the greatest challenge that they indicated, along with some of the physical demands of playing. Of course, retroactively looking at their career after 26 years or so. Aspects of retirement that they feel are difficult for them now. Loss of team membership is something they really relish and miss, and certainly dealing with injuries. The main reason why they left professional football as a player, injury and deselection, meaning no one wanted them. And then, certainly we, in this preliminary investigation, asked them what types of surgeries they had as pointing to some of the injuries that they have indicated. The knee injuries were prominent in this cohort and were certainly part of what they had to deal with in their post-career. So the commitment required to participate in the National Football League affects many aspects of their lives. The athlete's personal relationship with family, teammates, and other persons are critical to one's identity, social status, and support. The NFL athlete is also vulnerable to experiences of life struggles and have a significant effect on personal, social, and career development. But for an activity such as professional sport, these athletes have a unique opportunity to receive financial rewards as well as others for their successes. Did the NFL investigate or give a substantial investment in the development of these individuals regarding their retirement? Did it make a difference? The types of programs that they offer to current as well as former players? Did experiences earlier in life bear some relationship to present day experiences that might suggest that different approaches to help players succeed in life are apparent? What other resources did they use besides those offered by the league and their players association? And did the NFL and the NFL Players Association understand these relationships? And will they be willing to offer more long-term, offer programs that would address more long-term needs of their players? So the limitations of the study: players are drawn from just this volunteer sample of the 1994 study only, and conclusions can only be drawn from the responses of these players. The study includes only players who describe themselves as white or black in the 1994 investigation, and certainly only former athletes from the NFL apply to these conclusions. And the results of this investigation cannot be necessarily generalized to other sports. So I'll end here for any questions and refer back to you, Dr. Myers.
Thank you very much. That's you clearly have an exceptional data set, and we'll look forward to learning more about the follow-up. We'll now move to Inhyuk Steve Ha.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Ha. I'm so glad to be part of this great panel, to have an opportunity to present my research in collaboration with Dr. Sam Myers at University of Minnesota. We call this study the Asian paradox. I'm going to follow this order, and I want to start with a little bit background about the Asians' perception and what's going on right now. In according to 2012 National Asian Americans Survey, there was a question asking, do you favor or oppose affirmative action programs? And among Asian Americans, 75% favored. However, 15% opposed these affirmative action programs. And another survey, 2020 Asian American Voter Survey, done a few months before the presidential election last year, 70% of Asian Americans supported affirmative action. Obviously, the other 30% said no or neutral. Chinese Americans, only 56% are favored. So as we know, Asian Americans are fastest growing segment of United States population. And for the past 10 years, between 2000 and 2010, the overall population grew less than 10%. However, Asian population increased almost like a 50%. And the Asian Americans are also the only major racial ethnic group whose majority is naturalized citizens. So we have to take a different approach and think differently when it comes down to the issues related to Asian Americans. And according to PEW Research Institute's projection, in 3 decades, Asians will be the largest immigrant group, surpassing Hispanics. So the question is, are all Asian groups equally disadvantaged or advantaged? A little bit more background, just for your information. And once again, 2016 Asian American Survey, Asians were asked to prioritize their concerns about the country as a whole and individuals. Top 3 concerns are economy, jobs, healthcare, terrorism, not racism or racial discrimination. Still on the top, but not the highest. And if you look at this general social survey data, historical data between 1990 and 2018, to look at what other racial ethnic groups think. So the question about whether whites are hurt by affirmative action. And almost like a 40% of whites said not very likely. So it is this kind of phenomena occurs in other racial groups. And according to the same survey, this is a 2000 survey because this is the only cohort where there was a question about Asian. So are Asians committed to fair or equal treatment? And then blacks, whites, well, most people believe that Asians are not super committed or least committed, but somewhere in the middle. So question, the key question in this study is, are Asian Americans hurt by affirmative action programs? So we are going to test hypotheses asking whether the affirmative action programs hurt Asians in public procurement and contracting. And also we're gonna test hypotheses in the absence of affirmative action programs in procurement contracting, and Asians would be better off or worse off. So do they need affirmative action programs? Technically, we are going to adopt blind Oaxaca decomposition. And then also we are going to compare different results using alternative decomposition method. And so we are going to focus on disadvantaged business enterprises, and we also are going to do some like a simulation to see, to estimate the contract amount for Asians if there are no DB goals and how much they could possibly get. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, there are not a bunch of research on Asian Americans' attitude toward affirmative action in 1990s and 2000s. Personally, I'm an Asian American, but I didn't pay attention enough on the Asian-related issues so far. The question: what's the reason? What would it be? So one of the possible reasons might be a still relatively small portion of population. 2000 census, less than 5%. 2010 census, slightly over 5%. When Blacks over 13 and Hispanics over 18%. So it is quite recent. People started paying attention to this group of people. And then Asians are known to be not kind of politically active. I mean, I know kind of there are some exceptions individually, but other people agree on this. And then most Asians have so-called like a model image. Say, instead of being politically active, just individually, say, kind of people work hard and get a good job in professional area, like being a lawyer, a doctor, CPA, or something like that. And then, however, there are some studies, Asian Americans perceive they suffer from discrimination, and then a lot of sources of discrimination in college admission. Technically, we adopted blind Oaxaca decomposition, so I don't want to spend too much time on this method. But as we know, starting from this simple OLS regression, we are able to decompose, and then like this in the middle, and then so we should be able to kind of differentiate like a so-called explained gap versus unexplained gap. And so if we let beta star be a non-discriminatory coefficient vector, then traditional blind Oaxaca decomposition could be, say, beta star be beta of whites or beta of Asians. But if we do both, I mean, the results don't match all the time, and so we face so-called like an index number problem. So there's an effort to generalize this method, say by creating like a beta head star. It is a kind of weighted average between beta for whites and Asian, and then we are able to decompose this way the equation in the middle. So then we can say that the blind Oaxaca decomposition is nothing but a kind of weighted average between these two by introducing this omega as a weighting matrix. So the first one, like a blind Oaxaca decomposition, published 1973. I mean, then we can say beta head star would be either beta whites and beta for Asians. Reimers in 1983 and suggested why don't we take like a midpoint, simple average between the two. few years later, Cotton argued that, oh, we should consider like a relative group size. So still like a weighted average, but considering different size of group of each race. On the same year, kind of Newmark argued that, oh, we better use a like a coefficient estimates from kind of pooled regression. So the results are slightly different. So I'm going to show you all the results for comparison. For those who may not be familiar with disadvantaged business enterprise, I just want to spend about a minute to explain. So DBs are kind of for-profit small businesses where socially and economically disadvantaged. And then minority-owned, women-owned are presumably socially and economically disadvantaged, but other individuals like white firms can be also qualified on a case-by-case basis. There are some criteria in terms of net worth, gross income, and ownership, obviously at least 51%. And then they should be certified to be qualified. And then once they're certified, they can take advantage in terms of placing their bid for the contract where there are some kind of set-aside DB goals. So we use the data from New Jersey Transit procurement and contract between fiscal year 2006 and 13. As you may know, New Jersey Transit is one of the largest, they have largest affirmative action programs. And then in our data set, we have more than 1,000 prime contracts. And then there are some racial distribution, but in this analysis, we focus on just whites and Asians. These are the key variables in the data set and also used in the regression analysis. And then we took log of contract amount. And there is a kind of procurement method and industry classification, race. And also we merged this contract data with Dun & Bradstreet database so that we are able to obtain like a firm specific data, like a sales, number of employees, and the risk factor. And then each contract has DB goal between 0 and 1, like a 0% to 100%. And some kind of descriptive statistics for your information. And then obviously there is a big difference between white-owned firms and Asian-owned firms in terms of prime contract amount. So we run OLS regression, and then just the first panel, first column under all races as a reference point, show all. And then the other two, Asians and whites, and we run the model individually. And from this pooled model, and all like a minority groups, like a Black, Asian, Hispanic, and female, they are less likely have more likely to have kind of smaller contract dollars awarded compared to whites. So this is our key and summary table, and that I need to explain a bit. On top, panel A shows the predicted value of whites and Asians and difference, explained gap and unexplained gap according to the alternative decomposition method that I just explained. The first two columns shows traditional like a blind Oaxaca decomposition, and then in the middle, pooled method by Newmark, and then Walker ransom method and Reimers and Cotton method. So as you can see, numbers are slightly different, but they are quite consistent. So I think it would be easier to, because the values are log transformed. So we took exponential form to explain, like if you look at the bottom, like a panel B, say, for example, like a average contract dollar for whites is over $400,000 and Asians less than $300,000. And the difference is, say, kind of 1.4. What that means is Asians, whites have at least 41% higher than Asians have in terms of contract dollars. And then 64% explained, but unexplained gap is extremely big, like over 200%, which means, say, without any discriminatory behavior, Asian firms could have even more, like a bigger contract dollars in average than white firms do. So that's the way that we can interpret this way, and the results. And also we did some like a goal simulation, like in this example we showed that the with DB goals, and it shows like a mean of low contract amount for Asians and without DB goals. So the idea is, according to this simulation, the Asians could have, in the absence of DB goals, and then the Asian firms, that their contract dollars would be about 37.9% less than what they could have got. So what that means is still, I mean, Asians could get advantage with this this goal setting in the contract. And then also, this is my last slide, and so this shows that so far we look at the kind of contract dollar amount. However, they should place a bid, particularly for construction projects. So we look at their bidding process, what is happening in bidding. So out of this same data set, we grabbed this 179 prime contracts with the kind of information on bids and bidders, and 169 white firms and only 10 Asian firms. So 179 contracts, but in terms of, if you look at this kind of right-hand side first, there are more than 635 bids. So if you look at just the bid success rate for whites, about 20%, and then Asians, 14.6%. So apparently the difference is not huge. And then average individual bid success rate is 21% or 20.9%-ish. So it seems like there's kind of no noticeable difference between these two racial groups in terms of average individual bid success rate. However, if you look at the same data at the bidder level, so individual firm level, out of these 10 Asian firms, there are only two kind of key players. I mean, other than these two, they are all like kind of unsuccessful. So there's a huge difference between bidder success rate between these two groups, Asians and whites. So we can conclude, say, the composition results show there is an extremely huge unexplained gap. I mean, regardless of the alternative decomposition method between these two groups, Asians and whites. And Asian firms could have been better off if they were being treated like white firms. And then Asian firms could have been worse off if there were no DB goals in the contract. And then relatively small percentage of Asian firms are successful to award the contract. So bid success rate might be misleading us. So obviously our findings cannot conclusively prove the racial discrimination, existence of racial discrimination, but we have to look at carefully the process of public procurement and contracting in the United States. That's all. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. And we're going to hold off the discussion at the end, but I'm going to ask people to type their questions and answers into the window. We'll now move to Manzu.
Okay, so thanks for having me on the panel. I have my timer is up, so I will time myself. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Man. I am a PhD student at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. So as you can see, the title of my presentation is a little bit different from the program. The paper and the research project is same. Just when I write up the manuscript and prepare my presentation, I think this title is better than the original one. Okay, I will show you some preview of my results. Then I will go to the details of my project. So from my empirical analysis, I do find that there's higher educational achievement selection into the Han and Ethnicity intermarriage, which is implication of the educational authoritative mating. And by applying an instrumental verbal approach, I don't find statistically significant evidence of economic incentive for Han and Ethnicity intermarriage. But I do find different economic experiences for ethnic minorities and Han in their intermarriage. So if we have to conclude this project by one sentence, I do say the better economic status for people intermarried are due to their prior educational achievement, but not their marital status. Okay, so let's go to the details of my project. So I first want to give you a review of the inter-ethnic marriages in China. As we know, in the 5th and the 6th census of the China, the national share of inter-ethnic household is only 3%. And in the 7 West provinces, which are the sampled areas for my data, the share of inter-ethnic household is tripled, but it's still less than 10%. It is a small share. And then I just pull out the data from my survey and I give you this bar chart. As you can see, in my data, there is only 10.15% of the couples are intermarried. And among the intermarried couples, 80% of them are Han and Ethnicity intermarried couples. So I think we can draw two conclusions from the figures and the census data. So the first one is that intermarriage is not the main form of marriage in China. And if people choose to be intermarried, they are largely married to Han persons. And economists and the demographers, they think intermarriage differently from, so for the demographers, they think when the intermarriage has to be high when you have an imbalanced sex ratios, I think, which is a application for China. As we all know, China has very imbalanced sex ratio. And the economists want to think this problem from the maximized utility perspective. And we say when you choose your spouse, your partner, you want to maximize your utility and your household utility. And under the context of China, we think spouse, they can change their hukou status, which is a household registration system, and change their family background to achieve their maximize the utility. Finally, I want to add that is a unique case of China. That is, we have the one-child policy for 30 years. And as we know, the ethnic minorities, they are exempt from the one-child policy. So when we see if the Han person wants to have bigger family and wants to have more kids, their incentive to be intermarried is high. But this incentive is usually unobserved to scholars and from the surveys. Okay, so to understand what are the economic returns to Han and ethnic intermarriage, I use the Chinese Household Ethnic Survey of the 2011. So in that survey, the ethnic minority takes almost 60% of the sample, which is over sampled. because in a census, the ethnic minority as a total, it takes only 10% of the population. And the good thing is the survey surveyed all the 55 different ethnic Minzu groups. And because of the oversampling, we need to apply weights. So the weights are applied to my analysis. So finally, I want to acknowledge the data collection of the unit. The data is collected by the Chinese Academy of Social Science and the Minzu University. So then, therefore, for this project, I just want to answer this question. That is, what are the economic returns to Han and ethnic Minzu intermarriage in Western China? And in addition, I want to ask whether the intermarriage in Western China can alleviate some economic disadvantage faced by the ethnic Minzu people. So as always, I started from the OLALAS model, and I'm interested in the beta 1, which is the return of the inter-ethnic marriage. And as we all know, if there is endogeneity, that is saying the covariance between the error term from the OLS and the inter-ethnic status is not 0, I would have a biased estimator. And the bias could from the observed selection, and that is easily to be adjusted by controlling education. But the worst thing is I faced unobserved selection. As I said from the literature, there could be fertility incentive, and it also could be marry up incentive. And of course, I also face reverse causality between the earnings and the intermarried status. So to this end, and to address the endogeneity problem, I will use instrumental approach. So before that, I want to show you figures about the selection into intermarriage by educational achievement. So these two figures shows the share of intermarriage by gender and by educational achievement. As you can see at the top of the educational achievement level, there's a higher share of people to be intermarried. And I find the similar pattern among the males. So these two figures are for Minzu males and for Han males. Still, at the upper tail of the educational achievement, people are more likely to be intermarried. And then to address the unobserved selection, as I said, I use the instrumental verbal approach. So I have and developed 2 instruments for my estimates. The first one I call it is equal protection clause of Han and ethnic Minzu intermarriage. The second instrument is about the supportive attitude for inter-ethnic marriage if that happens to your children. I want to give you more details about the first instrument because as we know, in the Chinese marriage laws, they always say the marriage between Han and ethnic Minzu people are equally protected, and also say in the residential areas for ethnic minorities, the local government can and should adopt some adaptations for their realities. So therefore, I just go to all the counties are included in my survey and to see if they have a marital adoption regulation and whether in that regulation, it says clearly that Han and ethnic Minzu intermarriage are equally protected. If there is a clause, I will just give that county a value of 1. So the equal protection clause is a demi-verbal indicator for my instrument. And then in the first stage, I just estimate the probability of being intermarried. And then in a second stage for estimating the return to earnings, I just use the estimated probability from the first stage. Still, my interest is the coefficient of the beta 1. So I think when we use instrumental verbal approach, the most important thing is whether we satisfy the assumptions. So the first assumption and the important assumption is exclusion restriction. So I think for my instruments, the 2 instruments, they are only directly correlated with the probability of being intermarried, but not directly to correlated to the earnings. So especially for the equal protection class, the thing is, logically speaking, we think when we have a clause saying the marriage form is protected, there could be higher probability. But in the literature of the ethnography and anthropologists, they find in Western China, especially for the places they have the clause, people are still less likely to be intermarried given the social taboo or cultural restriction of being intermarried. So I do think my instrument at this point are satisfy the exclusion restriction. And then I think the second assumption I have to meet is the relevance assumption. That is, your instruments have to be significantly correlated with the probability of being intermarried. I will show you the results later. Before I go to the regression results, I just want to give you an overview of the earnings by marriage type. So as you can see, for intermarried Han males, their annual earnings is the highest. However, for the intra-married Minzu males, their annual earnings are the lowest. Except for the differences in the earnings, the people who are intermarried and intramarried are also different in other perspectives. As you can see, this table shows the results for female. And we know just for reading this table, the intermarried females, they are less likely live in rural and less likely to be migrant workers, more likely to be a Chinese community party member, and also less likely to live in the autonomous region. And I find a similar pattern among the males as well. So among the males, for intermarried males, still they are less likely to be live in rural areas and less likely to be migrant workers, more likely are the party membership. And all the differences are significant. So with the tables and the figures I show you, I just want to tell you the people who are intermarried are different from the people who are intramarried. Okay, then finally, we can move on to the regression results. So this coefficient plots, excuse me, this coefficient plots tell us the return to inter-ethnic marriage by gender. So as you can see, when I have the just have the OLS estimates, people who are intermarried does benefit from their intermarried status. However, when I apply the instruments, which are the equal protection clause indicator and the supportive of the intermarriage indicator, there is no longer significant returns from their intermarried status. Maybe it is not easy for you to look at the dots, but I can tell. And in the tables, their statistics show you the two instruments are significantly correlated with the probability of being intermarried. So from the coefficient plots, we know people do not have the economic incentives to be intermarried. And then to test the robustness of my model, I just separate my analysis by gender and by ethnicity. So these two coefficient plots tells the regression for ethnic minority females and ethnic minority males. So still, when we apply the instruments, the statistically significant results from intermarriage disappeared. And as you can see, the confidence interval for ethnic minority females are very large. I do suspect something is going on with the instrument variable estimates. Finally, let me show you the results for Han people. So still, when we apply the instrument, the significant return from inter-ethnic marriage, they disappear. Okay, so with that said, I just want to conclude my presentation. That is, with my survey data, I do see there's higher educational achievement selection into the Han-Minzu intermarriage. This is a little bit different from the private studies use the census. The author argue for highly educated people because they study in the Minzu University. They have higher likely to meet people from their own ethnicity, and they're both highly educated. So the probability for them to be intermarried is low. But I did not find that evidence. And then once I apply the instrument into my analysis, I don't find statistically significant of economic gains for from Han and ethnic intermarriage. Even though the coefficients are not statistically significant, but the coefficient itself still suggests there are different economic experiences for people in the intermarriage. And I think we need to pay attention to the lower end of the educational distribution, because we know they have a lower probability of being intermarried. If we want to know what are the economic gains for them, so we probably need to pay attention to the people at the lower end of the education. So by this end, I think people do have better economic status for them who are intermarried, but this is not from the marriage itself. I think this is just due to their higher educational achievement prior to the marriage. Okay, thank you. This is all.
Thank you very much, Manzu. You timed yourself well. In fact, you provided 3 extra minutes, for Greg Price, who's next on the agenda.
Okay, so I'm going to try to start sharing my screen here, and this is and here we go. So thank you, colleagues, and welcome once again. This is the second time we've had the opportunity to weigh in on this paper. And since that time, this paper has been accepted for publication. So it will be forthcoming in the Journal of Economic Studies. And it's a paper by myself and my graduate student, Doreen Adu, here at the University of New Orleans. Some colleagues ask down in my department about why does this paper fit in this particular session? I'm saying, well, it's the consequences of trade with the Chinese economy. Broadly. And so the inquiry was trade openness with China and initial driver of cross-country human coronavirus infection. So I'm going to summarize the paper. And for those of you that want to read the full paper, feel free to email me at gnprice@uno.edu, or you can stay tuned to the pages of the Journal of Economic Studies. But either way, if you want a quick version of the paper, just email me and I'll send one to you promptly. Okay. So, and let me, here we go. Okay. So, as we now know, the 2020 pandemic followed after the first reported infections were reported in China in December of 2019. Now, as the volume of trade associated with bilateral trade between countries can trigger bilateral travel flows of people who interact with their trading partner population who are possibly infected with communicable diseases, trade openness with China could be a plausible initial driver of the current COVID-19 pandemic. So note here, and when we clear that, it's a plausible initial driver, in that sense. So that's what we're trying to explore here, okay? So what this paper considers is that, was that indeed the case? That trade openness with China was an initial driver of the cross-country COVID pandemic, okay? Now, what we do is we appeal to a gravity model of a trade that links the number of COVID infections in a country to its bilateral trade volume with another country. And what we do is we estimate simple, seemingly unrelated, and zero-inflated count data specifications of a gravity model trade between China. So this is a particular gravity model. It just looks at trade with China and its trading partners, and where the number of COVID infections is a function of the number of distinct goods and services exported, imported from China. So we use a particular measure of exports and imports, the number of distinct goods in what's called these HSC categories. So it's a count. So it is a count. It's a count. Okay. So the gravity model is, is well known, and essentially it's basically the volume of trade between country I and J is proportional to the products of the GDPs of country I and J divided by the distance between the two countries. Okay. So that's a well-traveled, well-versed, well-appealed to model, which is what we use. Now, what we do here is we also consider the fact that the number of coronavirus infections is proportional to the trade volume, right? We're exploring that, okay? So, in other words, is there a relationship between the number of coronavirus infections in the Jth trading partner and country I's trade volume country J? So country I, in this case, is always going to be China, and J is its trading partners. So country I is always going to be China. J is going to be its trading partner somewhere in the world. Okay. Our data. We use the World Bank Open Trade and Competitiveness Data, or the TC Data 360, for the parameters of trade volume, China's GDP, and GDP for China's trading partners. We go to the geodatos to get the measured distance between China and each of its trading partners, centroids, basically, centroids, the center of China versus the center of the other countries. And then for the COVID counts, our COVID counts are through March 9th of 2020 from World Dominant Data. So that was a count of each China's trading partners' number of coronavirus infections as of March 9th, 2020. So initial, and that's where the initial part comes in, the initial driver, the initial COVID infection we observed as of March 9th. Okay. Then we also use from the World Bank Development Indicators a measure of tourism arrivals and the total number of inbound international tourists in 2018, and then the number of tariff agreements. These become controls for various of some of our specifications. Right. Our econometric approach. We use simple univariate Poisson negative binomial specifications between the mean count of trade volume and the mean count of the COVID infections. So the lambdas, mean for trade volumes and the mean for COVID counts. Then we use bivariate Poisson and negative binomial specifications, allowing for a joint dependency between trade volume and the COVID cases. For example, the mean of trade volumes and the mean here of the number of COVID cases. And we embed that in a seemingly unrelated framework to allow joint dependence between the two outcomes. Okay, right. So again, we also look at these zero inflated ones. Zero inflation just to account for the fact that if you don't count for X of zeros, because again, even zero is a possibility for COVID cases. And early on, as of March 9th, there were a lot of countries that had not yet reported any COVID cases. So it may be useful. It may be useful to count for the zeros, the excess zeros, just to make sure our parameter bias are an estimate. Okay. And then we also exploit these what's called given unobservable. So in other words, all specifications can suffer from specification bias. You don't observe everything. So we try to account for that with these unshared and shared frailty, where frailty becomes a way to model for unobserved heterogeneity. Okay. And this is the enhancement from the last time you saw this paper. A couple of you raised questions about the causal pathway. Particularly, I know, Sam, you made a point that what about boat traffic and other sorts of traffic? So we did a causal mediation analysis. Some external referees caught this too. We wanted to assess the implied causal pathway between trade volume and the travel of possibly infectious individuals, however they arrive to your shores, okay, boat, plane, or however, train in the case of in mainland Asia. So we want to account for that with a causal mediation analysis. And the idea here was how much of the causal effect of trade can be explained by travel. can be explained by traffic. Okay. So that's the enhancement. Okay. So we report in the paper, we report simple OLS, median regression, and some fixed group effects. Okay, in the paper. Okay. Right now, now what you'll see if you read the paper is that across all the specifications, trading volume with China, whether it's zero inflated, non-inflated, standard, bivariate, trading volume with China has a statistically significant positive effect upon the number of terminal arrivals, the elasticities of two, suggesting that trade with China has a significant effect upon the number of people visiting a Chinese trading partner. Okay, and we do a causal mediation analysis, and that suggests that the average causal mediation effect of terminal arrivals is approximately 15%. So the total treatment effect is 29%. So basically, this suggests that travel induced by trade flows can account for approximately 52% of the total treatment effect, suggesting that the cross-country flow of possibly infected individuals with COVID as a trading partner is a significant causal pathway by which COVID, in this case, early COVID-19 infections spread across the world amongst China's trading partners. Okay. Now, as far as the gravity model, I mean, for all the specifications, whether it's simple Poisson, zero inflated, bivariate, you get a significance pattern with what you would be expected from a gravity model of trade, okay? And that the number of early cross-country COVID infections increase with respect to trade openness to China. In other words, the larger TIJ is, the larger CIJ. In other words, it appears that the number of COVID infections was proportional to the trade volume with China and can account for approximately 24% of early infections amongst China's trading partners. Okay. Now, in conclusion, okay, our findings indicate that one of the costs of trade openness and globalization is the increased risk of human communicable diseases such as COVID being spread among trading partners. Okay. Now, in the case of the current and ongoing pandemic, our results suggest that a country's trade volume with China was an initial driver of early COVID-19 infections in the economies and population of China's trading partners. Okay. And it suggests that there are potential health costs associated with globalization and bilateral trade as it induces, bilateral flows of people who are possibly infected. Okay. So countries exposed to high volumes of bilateral trade should consider prioritizing and or establishing a robust disease surveillance systems as part of their immigration and custom protocols for visitors from countries in which communicable diseases have been identified or have a history of them. Okay. This could include better global cooperation among air traffic carriers, as there's evidence that their transit networks contribute to the emergence of global disease pandemics. So in a nutshell, I mean, that's, you please request the full paper. I'll send it to you, but thank you. So thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Price. One of the good things about doing this panel, both at the Southern Economic Association meetings and as well as the LERA meetings, is that we have opportunity to expand on some of the thoughts that we expressed on the first time. Moreover, we have more time than we had last time. Now, I want to turn this over to Bill Spriggs, who will offer his commentary, and then I'll give my commentary, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. And I'm going to urge people to type their questions in the question and answer window.
Okay, thank you. And I guess I'm fresh ears since I didn't participate in this panel at the Southern Economic Association meetings. I guess I'm sort of like what Greg just said, trying to tie together a theme. So I will try and force a theme uh, and impose it on your research. If that's not the direction you wanted to take it, at least I'm trying to find what I think a theme was. So I was very intrigued by the Lewis paper that started us off. I guess I'm sad that the first step you had over 500 players, and now we're down to a much smaller sample to look at. I think within the framework of the title of the panel, it was a little disappointing that the sample size got so small, because the things that initially struck me about the differences in the players in that first wave was the tremendous gap in college attainment between the white and the Black players. And so I was very curious and hopeful to get answers whether, using the platform that they had, Black players were able to close this gap soon after retirement, and where they stood in that process. That would say a little bit more to me about some of what's going on when we think about what professional sports is and what it's about. Yep. And how, even though it can be the same thing, there really are these different currents flowing that would make it more disturbing. So, I mean, just anecdotally, last week, when Washington had to get another quarterback, the quarterback they pulled was in the middle of taking his final exams at Old Dominion University, indicating fully that he was out of the game for a moment, yep. But he was continuing to pursue his degree, and so it sort of highlighted this. You know, do people go back and finish? And now we have the great example with the new coach at Jackson State University, how even though he played at Florida State, right, he went on to finish not at Florida State, which I thought was another statement in and of itself, that he was committed to getting his degree but got it somewhere else. Yeah.
Was that Talladega? Did he finish at Talladega? Did he finish at Talladega?
Well, I don't remember what it was. It was
I think it was yeah.
It was, but it showed he was committed to getting that degree. And I wish that there were some questions about savings, because I think this is the thing that always amazes the rest of us, that right, from an economist perspective, part of the high salary is, this is hazard pay. It's clearly hazard pay, obviously hazard pay. And, you know, the extent to which players appreciate this is hazard pay, and therefore you have to save with the anticipation that it's covering that hazard. And so whether players were in more or less precarious positions, depending upon those kind of decisions, I think would be helpful to know. The other thing is to understand the differences in the colleges that the players attended. So the tendency of teams to either only choose Black players who are drafted, and therefore to over-select Black players who are premier programs, versus white players who might make it into the league who aren't from premier programs. I was kind of curious about that, and I bring that up because the highest paid person in most states is the coach of the flagship team, correct, in their state, Alabama, Mississippi, wherever. And it always struck me that when people say to players, you're all not going to be in the NFL, it's like, yes, but you're acting like college coaches don't get paid money, a lot
Right.
of money.
Right.
And so to me, the greater irritant is, what's the ratio of the players to the coaches in these premier programs where these coaches get paid a lot of money?
Yeah.
And I don't mean the head coach. I mean, we all know the head coach gets paid a lot of money, but the defensive coordinator is getting paid a lot of money. The other coaches are getting paid a lot of money, and I don't see a lot of Black people getting those jobs either.
Yeah.
And so the extent to which there doesn't seem to be this fallback, which is, I have this special skill on a special level, and as much as people denigrate that skill, it is a skill. It's worth a lot of money. People pay a lot of money for people who have that knowledge. Even if I didn't finish my business degree, I don't see why I don't get to be the line coach at Alabama.
Yeah.
I don't,
Right.
And that's a good paying job. I would take that. It's more than what I get paid if you're the line coach at Alabama. So, I just wonder about the depth of the institutional structures of sports, how that interfaces with race. And so I would hope to see the research maybe go a little deeper into how these different layers show up that I don't think a lot of people appreciate, because I think too many people see the game, see a lot of Black representation, see the salaries, and then don't get into how does this all fit together, because at the end of the day, whether it's who gets to be announcers, which is a lucrative job, again, dependent upon your knowledge of the game, be a coach, which means you got to know the game.
Yeah.
That these avenues don't always open up with that same set of equal opportunity where the talent is. So, and the extent to which players are able to convert their savings into some platform from which they can leverage. And it strikes me that some players do. I'm going outside of football. You presented football, but I think of a Dave Bing who did a wonderful job. You think of Magic Johnson, who did a wonderful job of converting their leverage and their opportunity to be very successful business operators.
William, I don't want to cut you off because you get into a lot of issues. I do want to say, and in reference to your last aspect of it, though, you're talking about players who played a significant amount of time and reached the highest peaks of their careers, who were able to transition into some of these lucrative other alternative careers. But I just want to stop you there for a second so that you can maybe continue. But I do want to highlight some of the things that you had mentioned, because you involved a number of issues that could certainly be brought out in the research. And by and large, I had mentioned that this was the first step in the investigation, so that we can really focus on some of the economic, employment, educational issues with the players, and make sure that our instrument is focused when we start to send this out electronically to the other players. So this core pilot group is really going to give us a framework by which we reach the others, and hopefully we can reach a significantly amount of them. I think you pointed to some of the enculturation of an athlete, beginning with how they're socialized in sport, certainly being able to devote a number of hours and time, albeit escaping the injury route, but being able to devote a lot of time into this social practice, being part of the culture that values sport, and the participation in some of these sports, which is certainly advocated by the influencers, the pro athletes, the economy, the media, which really kind of channel some of these athletes, primarily in football, a significant amount of Black athletes, channel them into this sport through the influencing through the media, and because you have a number of prominent athletes who are helping to inundate our youth with the value of being an athlete. And then, certainly one of the things is that we're trying to connect with our former players is, what would they do differently? Would they save more money? Would they possibly prepare themselves before their, would they have prepared themselves differently before their career ended? What would they have done after that career in terms of their choice of an alternative occupational issue? Regarding the colleges, now we're getting into this elitism with our colleges, where there's this 5-conference elite set of colleges and institutions who seem to be separating themselves from the other colleges in terms of value to the networks, to the corporate elite, and how those individuals who are in those institutions are able to by and large, have a greater opportunity to be professional football players. At the same time, athletes' rights and activism is more prominent on these campuses too, whereby now athletes are being able to maybe grab a part of that economic value by sharing some of their worth, or being able to accumulate a salary or some type of stipend that helps them get through the college experience, and possibly eventually graduate from college, and then the coaching. Obviously, the coaching is a corporate function. Okay, these are corporate executives, and the corporate function is very apparent on institutional research institution campuses, and they are kept at that elite level because colleges are becoming more corporate like, meaning they can't function without corporate influence. And then lastly, these coaches are in these attractive positions because they are allowed to do that, and the people who are making the decisions are primarily white male, who like to see people like themselves in these positions. Okay, so I think there's this enculturation that is developing, that either, whether you're on the side of and what we're trying to do is highlight some of the disparities between white and Black players, but also white students and Black students. Whether you look at this corporate culture as really advocating for the status quo in this respect, or when the person who is really making the decisions is primarily of one ethnic group, then yes, you will find some of these disparities involved in who gets to be a former player who also can be a coach or a corporate head or an owner in this case.
Yeah.
We're gonna devote some time.
Yes, I just want to make sure we got to that.
Well, I appreciate that. I'll limit my other comments then, so that Sam doesn't stop being nice to me. I just want to spend a little bit of time on Manchu's paper. Very interesting on intermarriage. I mean, and she does a great job in citing the literature, so we get a sense that people have already looked at some of the sort of typical issues you would think of with intermarriage, opportunities for groups to see each other, meet each other, and people have already made some predictions about the rate of intermarriage, and she goes over the exception given to the one-child rule as, if you will, a reward to someone, a couple that that does intermarry, so that they have the potential to have 2 children, and I guess please both sets of grandparents or something. But I'm wondering if the way to look at the economic incentive is really at the individual level. I'm wondering if the real incentive comes about from the breaking down of group identity. So, I mean, if as a biological issue, right, in the United States, not through marriage. I mean, we know that the United States really is more diverse than what we let out, precisely because we made miscegenation illegal, and therefore we don't technically recognize the fact that the bulk of the African American population in the United States really is of, quote, mixed race. So we pretend like that's not true, but it's more true than, you know, we admit by a lot. So in a different context where miscegenation would have been allowed, you would think that the concept of race would be different in the United States on account of that. So if you look at whites who were allowed to marry across groups, right now, many people who are considered white in the United States will, you know, then let out their litany. Well, I got, you know, Italian grandparents and Polish grandparents and Irish grandparents, right? They fully indicate that they didn't come over as Italians and stay among themselves, or come over as Irish and stay among themselves. In effect, it's kind of unusual if you run across them in the United States and they're just Irish. I mean, that's like very unusual. So to what extent can the whole equation, the whole concept change? And part of that presumably is that intermarriage makes it that complex thing. It's that someone starts trying to say what they are and they end up giving up because there's so many things. And so you wonder if that's really an individual thing or a group thing. So I'm wondering if, as you point out, a place where people do meet and where language and other things aren't as great a barrier, or when they're both college educated, I wonder if there aren't enclaves or business settings in which you see greater intermarriage, and whether that doesn't present some differences. So I may not see it on the individual level, but I wonder if it begins to have a group effect. I mean, you know, like South Africa, Cape Town is known to be dominated by the quote unquote coloreds. And so I wonder if there's an enclave where you could use some sort of variation to look at this from a different level. I mean, you do point out that intermarriage it's still not that common, so maybe these don't exist, but I just wonder if that's the way to look at it. And if it's not enclaves, I just wonder whether, because it tends to be true more among college educated, if there aren't occupations or if there aren't industries where it's more common that the acceptance makes for differences. That would be, I think, an interesting direction to maybe take this in, and see where that went. And finally, Greg, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced why China. Why not just a paper on trade? Why not because this was a pandemic and because it spread so quickly, why isn't this just a comparison of openness? Why isn't it just countries that were more open ended up seeing the disease a lot more? Because I'm sorry, when you tell me it's 25%, okay, then that's 75% that has nothing to do with China, but probably has something to do with openness of trade. And so I'm not clear why a country has to be the culprit here. I think the culprit has to do with trade openness, and I'm not sure why that isn't the true counterfactual here, and why, you may end up telling me that yes, those countries that were the most open have the most problems. It's hard though, because I mean, we know in the case of the United States, it was because of the stupidity of the guy who we're trying to get rid of. And so, I mean, to me, that makes it hard, because we are one of the countries far more open to Chinese trade, but we're also the country that had the stupidest person in the universe in charge to respond to it. And when you think of the countries that did do poorly, the UK and the US, were both slightly more open. So I think the counterfactual is probably not clear to me that it's China trade only. It's openness to trade and not having competent leadership.
Well, Bill, no, basically, we're taking the epidemiology of disease as being true, that the first documented cases were in China. So did it spread there initially? So of course, there's going to be spillovers between the United States and Canada, obviously, but we just want to track down whether is disease one of the costs of trade. So we have this case where the first reported cases of COVID were in Wuhan. Now, we may find that it could have been in Italy later on, but for now, I mean, well, does trade help spread disease? Initially, that's all, yeah. So it's not to pick on China, but the evidence suggests that the first documented cases were in Wuhan. Now, if it's Italy, I mean, it can be Italy as well too, but is the spread of communicable diseases one of the costs of trade, right?
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. To me, the correct thing is openness to trade, not China. It's openness to trade. And so in any country that was more open, period, was going to have lots of people, because the interconnectedness comes home really fast. Mm-hmm. And so to me, rather than it being about China, I think the paper would have been more powerful. It would have been just trade.
Yeah. And of course, in our estimators, of course, we try to account for these unobservables, the seemingly unrelated correlations between trade volume, borders, and the COVID cases. So, and the gravity model is a measure of trade openness. I mean, the volume of trade you have with a particular country. Yeah. But no, I mean, duly noted. I mean, we can't answer those type of questions, but it's just a look at what are the costs of free trade.
Yeah, but it's openness. It didn't have to be a gravity model with China, right? It's just, are you open? Are you having huge movements of people? And you should think about that. If you are going to engage in trade, you should be thinking about that.
So as always, Professor Spriggs has provided insightful comments. I'm kind of cautious about raising my comments about Greg's paper, largely because it's already published. But there are two things that I hope when the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times quotes from your paper, you'll clarify. The first is, what's your definition of China? And so there's one notion of China that includes Taiwan, and includes Hong Kong. But then there's another definition of China that's mainland China. It turns out that a lot of trade is going on between Hong Kong and the rest of the world, between Taiwan and the rest of the world. But not everybody would agree that that should be included in your definition of China. So that's my first suggestion. You have an answer to that question when the Wall Street Journal raises the concern. The second is, well, what's the mechanism of this transmission of the coronavirus? Is it people or is it boxes? Is it the good itself? And I think that the science suggests that the transmittal rates are greater from person to person as opposed to from the box or from the package, to others. But the dilemma is that, are you referring to the boats? Are you referring to the planes? Because if you're referring to the boats as a grandson of someone who spent his whole life as a messboy, as a steward on merchant ships, I'll tell you that the nationality of the boat isn't always the nationality of the workers on the boat. And many Chinese owned carriers have workers who are not Chinese. They are from Philippines, they're from Indonesia, they're from Africa. And so I just hope you realize that somebody's going to interpret your paper as kind of like the proof of the virus jumping from China to the rest of the world, but there's a little bit of gap here in the rhetoric. So I hope that you're prepared for that. With respect to Manzu, I just want to point out that one of the strongest findings that you don't talk about is the value of inter-ethnic marriage among individuals who are members of the Communist Party. And so the question is, well, what's the process of rewarding people who are in inter-ethnic marriages who are in the Communist Party? Is it that you are more likely to be members of the Communist Party if you are in inter-ethnic marriage? Or is it that the Communist Party is more likely to reward you if you're in ethnic marriage? And so those interesting coefficients that you don't really talk about much are the ones that might be worthy of having a separate paper or a future publication of what's the politics of an ethnic marriage. With respect to Steve's paper, which I guess I'm a co-author, I want to be sure that we recognize that the Small Business Administration doesn't acknowledge H-1B or green card holders as people eligible for small business set asides. And the definition of disadvantaged business enterprise is a firm that is a small business enterprise as defined by the Small Business Administration. And so that raises the question that there's a distinction, one that we in Minnesota don't like to talk about, a distinction between Asians who are foreign born and who are resident aliens, but who are not citizens. There's a distinction in the Small Business Administration between Asians who are citizens versus those who are non-citizens. And so it's an interesting phenomenon is that are the Asians that we're talking about in this data set, the Asians who are the expanding, growing immigrant business owners, or the Asians that we're talking about, the Asians who've been in America for years and years and who've been subjected to all sorts of forms of discrimination. And I think it's worth trying to see whether or not the data can be nailed down to make that distinction.
Well, I hope in the future, Sam, you would, because it's only in the United States that such a group exists, right? Only in the United States would somebody have a category called Asian American, because it doesn't make sense. I mean, even given America's history, because initially we had explicit laws, Asian people from the whole continent were prevented from coming. Then when we had the openness with Japan, we allowed some Japanese in. Then during World War II, because we took sides against the communists, we were very sympathetic to having nationalist Chinese come in, and we took efforts to try and increase their numbers. We had the efforts in the Deep South following the Civil War, even though we had laws, you couldn't have Asian immigrants, but Mississippi recruited heavily to get Chinese to try and replace African Americans who didn't want to be sharecroppers. And then we have our sort of twisted relationship with the Philippines and our involvement in being, first they're liberators, then the colonizers, and then this sort of sick relationship that gets a lot of people from the Philippines. And so all of them from different misadventures of the United States, none of them from the same historical period, none of them from the same country. They don't have anything in common other than American racism that says anybody from that whole continent must be alike. So hopefully, yes, in the future you will.
I agree with that. I fully agree with that understanding that Asians is an interesting creation of imagination of the United States, not a reality. Because whenever I go to China, people keep talking about, well, we're Chinese. I don't know what you're talking about when you say Asian. And so it turns out that in fact, one of the chapters in Manzu's chapter deals with miscegenation laws, which is occurring about the same time as the Asian Exclusion Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And of course, there's a Supreme Court case of a Japanese who is excluded from ownership property in California. They said, no, I'm not Chinese. This is Chinese law because I'm white. And so I went to the Supreme Court and says, Japanese white. So I fully agree with you that there's this legacy, but there's legacy of discrimination against a group that is more of a social construct. But for Steve's analysis, I think the bigger issue has to do with the fact that all of our data sets aggregate Asians together, when in fact the reality is that you've got in New Jersey, for example, highly educated Indian engineers. So Rutgers University is one of the biggest producers of engineers of Indian engineers in the state of New Jersey. But a relatively small number of those Indian engineers are actually native-born Indians. Of course, by time they will be native-born because their children, are growing up in New Jersey. But then that raises the question about whether the DBE program, which shows that there doesn't appear to be underrepresentation of Asian or Black or American Indian because they're collecting them all together as one group called disadvantaged individuals or minority individuals. Is it possible that one group within that aggregate of minorities is driving the entire distribution of effects? And that's something that I think anybody who does work on public procurement contracting needs to worry about when they use this artifact called Asian.
Just one quick response. I mean, Sam, so if one has an anti-Chinese agenda and you read my paper, we only account for 24%, Bill, only 24%. If you want to blame, if you absolutely positively have to blame China and you use that paper, Well, it's 24% of the cases. So there's another what? 76 that can't be explained by trade with China. Sam, it's the People's Republic of China. Now, in the revision, we go through a causal mediation analysis. In other words, how much of this can be explained by the travel flows between China's trading partners, right? So we clarify that there. In other words, how much of the causal effect of trade can be explained by the travel flows triggered by trade with China? Whatever the source may be, boat, plane, automobile, train, or swimming, right? So there's no quantitative argument there. It's just that, yeah, there is some evidence suggesting that, yeah, there is a trap that is to travel triggered by trade. So that's, so again, please email me for the paper and you can execute your further judgments upon it by just reading the paper.
Oh, well, I urge you when the newspapers call you to say just that, because that's a more honest response than what I think some people will try to infer from the paper.
Sure.
Okay. But let me also say that there was an early version paper, I'm not sure if it's still in the paper, that alluded to tourism. And I'm trying to say, well, who is flying to Mozambique to go to the beach? And the answer is, you get stopped in Frankfurt. You can't fly. You might be able to get to Frankfurt, but can't get out of Frankfurt, down to Mozambique because the flights have been canceled. And so if indeed there's a source of transmission through tourism, then you need to acknowledge the fact that, well, how do people get there? Oh, by the way, when's the last time you went to Disneyland or Disney World or Universal City, or for that matter, the Statue of Liberty? So who are the tourists? Am I saying something that's offensive to anybody?
Well, in March there were tourists. Certainly in March of 2020, people were traveling still. Yeah, between January and March, they're traveling. Yeah.
We have a question in the question and answer from Bill Rogers, and it's for you, Louis. Back to the NFL, another group to be concerned with is Division I football players that don't get drafted but played all 4 years and got injured, or injuries that create problems later in life and need health care. And he brings up the example of a Northwestern quarterback who now has a rod in his leg and chronic health problems from that. I didn't realize that he ended up being injured. The young man who tried to form the union, I didn't understand that in the end he ended up being injured. And the NLRB said that he wasn't, and he was not an employee, even though the record sent to the NLRB showed that I think he was pulling 60 hours, and his window for courses at Northwestern was something on the order of, if you take a class between 10 and 3, okay. And granted, Northwestern is a huge university, but I don't know how you can graduate from any of our universities if you can only take a class if it's between 10 and 3. It would be very hard to pick up all the electives. So I guess he wanted you to sort of, I mean, your sample clearly is selected to those who made it, but
yeah,
is there a way to capture the ones who didn't?
Well, the NCAA is, certainly needs to be a partner in this. Obviously, player safety is one of those athlete activism strategies that are becoming more apparent now, because indeed there are many more college, in this case, football players who are not going to play professionally than there are. Only 1% of the potential, that the college athletes go to the next level, particularly in football. So indeed, you're going to have by and large, I would say that a large percentage of college football players finish their careers with some type of chronic injury. Now, how long that chronic injury lasts, I'm not sure, but or whether it enables them to be classified as disabled. I have no stats on, but I think that is one of the cultural issues of the day, in that these individuals spend 4 years representing their colleges. By and large, a certain percentage of them leave that college without a degree and injured, or without health care, particularly health care that addresses those chronic injuries that last with them in some instances for the rest of their lives. So that is not a prominent as prominent as of an issue as should be, but it certainly is one that the National Collegiate Athletic Association is aware of, and also is one that the student athletes are aware of, and they're becoming more of a voice in their welfare.
So I'd like to thank Bill Rogers for raising his question and getting us back to a discussion about Leo Lewis's paper, because there are two things I think you should know about that work. The first, and not everybody was online when we're having this conversation about this theoretical construct that Leo has developed, called positional segregation. And that's going to be actually an important component of the future work about why there are pay differentials, why there are hiring differentials by position. Before this panel started, we were arguing about why the Vikings didn't make the playoffs, and arguably it's because of one white guy, who missed 4 field goals. But if he were not white, he wouldn't have been playing. He would not have continued to play, for the Vikings. And so there's a counter argument that says, well, place kicker, field goal kickers are lowly paid, and talented Black people could make more money, as a wide receiver or as a running back. And my response is, yeah, but place kickers stay in the league for a long time.
Yep.
And injury rates are much lower, for kickers. And I asked the question, well, how hard is the kick? I mean, how do people out there who can kick the ball between?
Well, that becomes a cultural issue. The communities in which these players come from don't value a place kicker more than they value those other positions. And that's why you don't,
long snapper. I want to be a long snapper.
Yeah, that's, for example, why you don't see a diverse number of place kickers and long snappers and centers. Although, it's becoming, in terms of racial segregation in these areas, becoming more pronounced and more evident. However, the kicker and punter has been a good case to look at in regards to how culturally ethnic groups look at those positions, but in converse to how valuable they are on the team.
Well, but it raises your other question too. I mean, you look at a number of athletes who have played both baseball and football, and these are really talented people.
Mm-hmm.
Your career as a baseball player is much longer.
Yeah.
And your chance of a major injury are much lower.
Yes.
Much lower. And I've often puzzled how Black people have walked away from baseball given these differences.
Well, William, yeah, you don't find baseball in the inner city. There's a significant number. The opportunity is an issue too. Opportunities in some of these sports. Now, African Americans primarily are focused on 4 or 5 sports in our country, basically, in terms of percentages. And again, it goes back to culture, access, value in that community. and baseball is becoming less valued among African-American youth, for example, but also the access is not as abundant as it used to be.
Yeah, you know, when we used to have baseball as the sport, there are a lot of Black people of an older generation that was the sport. So even growing up in the inner city didn't really stop it, because people played stickball and they played whatever variation they could come up with. And in the same way that, you know, football requires a lot of equipment and a pretty big field. It's not like basketball.
But baseball requires a significant number of people in order to really have a game. You know, you need people at each base, you need people in the outfield. I mean, it requires you to get together quite a few people to really have an official game. Now, you would say football requires 22 people, but you know, you've got high schools who have 6-man, 7-man football, you know, and they're able to adapt a little bit. If baseball could do that, that would be great, to be able to adapt and minimize their sport so that it could be adaptable to all communities.
Us old timers, we used to just play.
I know.
Stealing bases.
I know.
Each other.
I know.
When you couldn't get a full game going, at least you could play steal a base.
Well, so, again, I go back to the cultural issue. Kids don't just go out and play like that anymore. They need supervision for some reason, you know.
So I would caution against the cultural explanation for sports. There's a book that tries to allege that the reason why Blacks are underrepresented among competitive swimming is that Blacks prefer to play basketball, and that you know, it's kind of like Blacks don't like to swim. You know, Blacks don't like to get wet. You know, Blacks think that they catch a cold if they swim. And I point out that in 1966 to 1968, there were 33 historically Black colleges that had nationally ranked competitive swimming teams. And Howard University, Morehouse's competitive swimming team had times that were comparable to the University of Minnesota's times at the time. The University of Minnesota was in Big Ten. And so it turns out that this view that, well, why there's an underrepresentation of Blacks in sports A or B is because they don't like to do it, is actually ahistorical. No. It doesn't actually understand and represent the fact that we had the Negro Leagues in baseball. You know, we had competitive swimming from Blacks that goes back a long time. But with that said, they just said that we have 1 minute left. So I'd like to use that 59 seconds to thank every one of the members of the panel and the members of the audience who bared with us for the past 2 hours. And we look forward to seeing all these papers in print.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Stay safe and healthy.